Lincoln and I weren't planning on recording this, but we suddenly are now because
Well, I'll sit nearer to you then, because you won't hear me from that.
right, we're just on the phone. We haven't got our microphones and whatnot.
Stick it on there.
Yeah, it's something that it, basically this is all about the lockdown files. Okay, this is all about what's come out in the WhatsApp messages since Isabelle Oakeshott released them and broke the NDA. Okay, so is there a part of me that is thinking, I told you so? Yeah, there is massively.
Yeah,
But I don't like people who do that, but there is massively.
yeah, there is, and that's what angers me when I'm reading these things, is the well, just the aggression actually that I saw towards you when you had your views, even from the very beginning, and I just this leak has infuriated me, but as well as that, there's a part of me that feels that this is the time for me to be able to say what you went through and how you were resilient and had everything, everything was out on the table with you, and you shared these things, and you got a lot of grief from people, and it's unforgivable. And honestly, I was funny today. I feel angry about it.
I mean, and let's be honest, in the early days, Lincoln, it caused, arguments between us because, and let me just say to the people listening that wasn't because you weren't on my side. It was because as my husband and my main protector and my main ally in life, you were very worried about me.
Yes.
You were worried about how it was going to affect me mentally.
Yeah.
Because I was so committed to it. And you were worried about how the reaction was going to affect me. And you were worried about whether I was going to lose work because of it. And let me say to people, I've touched on my COVID situation views over the, for years, and certainly in this podcast. But I can only describe the origins of my commitment and my I don't know what the word is, I can't think of it, politicization, as someone who would never put their head above the parapet politically, particularly. And it was when people talk about having a religious calling, or they talk about being a teacher as a calling, or they talk about being a policeman as a calling. I mean, could you say that acting is a calling? I guess so. But I have never felt a political calling that I did like the COVID situation. And it was never, ever to do with doubting that COVID was a serious virus. And I want to make that very clear.
Yeah.
It was never about that. I never said those words. People called me a COVID minimizer and
Denier.
They called me a denier.
They called you a denier.
Oh, no. Well, Piers Morgan called me a denier.
Oh, yeah, but that other
people did call me a denier.
Yeah.
Piers Morgan publicly called me a denier, and he had a very big voice, and that's unforgivable. But I don't really, my feelings about him. And he's done the biggest U-turn in the history. It's quite laughable. But mine was never about denying COVID. It was never about minimizing COVID. What it was about was knowing that there was propaganda going on to frighten us. It is now been proved in the WhatsApp messages where Matt Hancock, and people think I've got this one-man tirade against Matt Hancock. He was the fucking health secretary. He was the boss of this, before Boris Johnson. And it's got very little to do with him subsequently breaking the rules. It's got very little to do with him subsequently breaking the rules. That's just the utter hypocrisy that stank and ran rife throughout this whole situation. But for me, it was, I saw a nation, I saw a world plunged into utter fear and terror. And I saw our own family and your mother, who believed every single word that the BBC said.
I know.
You know, and ITV said, because and they were following the science. That's what they said. I talked to people, Lincoln, as you know, on a WhatsApp group at the time, who were all people who shared my particular views about the fact that we were being led by a nudge unit, and we were being led by people who wanted us frightened into submission. And they actually frightened us as a nation and as a world. But I'm talking specifically about the United Kingdom. They frightened us into submission without 3 days. It was one of the easiest things that they ever did. And what I could not believe is how people went along with this without questioning.
Yeah.
I wasn't saying they were wrong and I was right. I was saying, ask the fucking questions. Why are you just blindly going along with this? You know, and also, because I was on this WhatsApp group, because I'd made my views clear, and I'm being woolly about what my views were. Okay. It started, and I've said this before, but I'm going to say it within context now. The time I absolutely was convinced of that there was foul play was the bridges. I think I even mentioned this on last week's podcast, was when people were denied. They were denied the opportunity to go to funerals, to give their husband, wife, sister, brother, daughter, son of 50 years a proper send-off, because they were told that they would kill everybody if they did. And therefore, people were watching their loved ones being buried on a video screen while maybe two people in masks were stood by the graveside or in the crematorium. Meanwhile, on Westminster Bridge, outside Chelsea and Westminster Hospital, I apologise if I'm repeating myself on this, but it's important. You know, I remember seeing something from Hertfordshire Police on Twitter, and it showed all of the nurses and stuff outside the hospital on a Thursday night when we were clapping for carers. It showed people who'd brought bottles of wine down. It showed people who were coming down with their children. It was
a full-blown party.
It was a full-blown party. It showed people who'd brought a karaoke machine down and was singing outside. Similarly happening in South Shields. Similarly happening in wherever it was around the country. But I remember specifically seeing Hertfordshire Police putting out a tweet saying, basically, great time tonight celebrating our wonderful NHS. It's like, what the fuck are you doing? We had been told to stand at our doors and clap and bang a pan. But suddenly, on a Thursday night, COVID went out the window. So those people who were saying, you know, there's dead bodies falling out the hospitals, and I know that there was in some circumstances. How was it that the nurses could come out unmasked, go back in mask, put their mask on, and carry on with life? But because it was building up the NHS, which had been struggling for years, I just thought, hang on a minute, I've got a sense of what this government are doing. They are so desperate to be able to blame the NHS failings on COVID, on this one illness, that it is in their best interest, to allow us to big up the NHS, even in this most hypocritical way, where us minions are told to stand and bang a pot. But because it's about the NHS, Thursdays are allowed to become a fucking carnival. And I remember one Thursday night when, again, people had been threatened with arrest if they approached their relatives in a crematorium situation. Two sons went to look after their grieving mother, and it still makes me so angry, Lincoln. You know, sometimes I don't want to talk about it because
it's disgusting. It's unbelievable.
It makes me so angry.
No.
What I felt about it, and I couldn't understand that. What I was trying to say was, can't you see that on this Thursday night at the time, I said this on Loose Women, and I did say it openly, and I was allowed to say it, and I got a lot of support from it because I'd actually vocalized something that a lot of people were thinking, and it was that Cressida Dick, the head of the police, was out there clapping, surrounded by loads of people coming back, come out to the bridge to celebrate. You had the police in a great big line of police cars with the sirens blaring. You had the fire engines with the sirens blaring. You had the ambulances with the sirens blaring. This is not a criticism of them per se. They all do wonderful, wonderful work, of course. But it was the government of thinking, how are you letting this happen week after week after week? If this was the serious illness to everybody, then all these people are going to die who are on the bridge, surely, because they might have COVID.
Yeah, I know.
So
I remember you saying it at the time.
How was it possible that these people weren't all going to die?
Yep.
How was it possible that no masks were ever worn in Downing Street? And the thing is, I knew these things, Lincoln, as well, because of my views, because of my passion and my preparedness to put my head above the parapet, for no other reason than to say to people, please don't be as frightened about this as them trying to make you out. People were literally locking themselves away from family. People went 2 years or a year without seeing anybody because they thought that if they touched somebody, they would die of COVID. Now, we all know that many of the deaths from COVID were with COVID. Okay. There was massive spread within the hospitals because they couldn't control it. They never were able to cope with MRSA, which was the other thing that was going around hospitals. So, and also, I'm jumping because I get so passionate about it. There were so many lies told, okay? I was on a WhatsApp group with doctors, with epidemiologists, with virologists. Now, on Twitter, people would go, oh, yes, of course you are, Professor Welch, you fucking COVID denier.
Saw it all the time.
I would show you when I had a conversation with, say, for example, Dr. Raghid Ali. I'm going to mention his name because I did talk a lot to him about it.
Yeah.
Now, he was a pro-vaccine advocate, but he was also very aware of the propaganda that was going on. And what I'm glad about is that it has come out that Boris Johnson was talking regularly to Raghid Ali and to Carl Hennigan, people who were saying this hysteria has got to stop. These people that you're using for modelling at Sage, these people like Neil Ferguson, the fucking guy, right, who invented lockdown and weeks later shipped his own married mistress in to shag her. Well, why was that okay to do? And all of these things were happening. And I couldn't understand why logical, sensible people, friends of ours, relatives of ours, were looking on me with disdain.
Yes, they were.
And that I should be doing exactly what the other people were doing and I should be accepting. And the other thing that got me was people of the left, and I'm historically of the left, I'm a Labour supporter, always have been, I've never voted Tory in my life, right? But I've never felt so personally affected by anything. But the fact is that what I couldn't understand is that people of the left, who I knew that historically hated the Tories, the one thing they were accepting without question was anything about COVID. So they would question anything that Boris Johnson or any of the Tories did. But at those nightly conferences, they were there with their fucking Handmaid's Tale outfits on, going along totally and utterly with everything. And the other thing that got me, and I'll never fucking forgive people for this as well, is that the amount of people, the amount of blue tick people who privately supported everything I said and did,
yes, I know,
but would never once put their heads above the parapet.
I saw it.
I would show you private Twitter messages from people.
Yeah, celebrities. People with a voice.
Yeah, with a voice.
Who didn't say anything.
And people who would say to me, have you seen this, Denise? Wanting me to put it out there.
You to put it out.
And not only did they not say anything, they would actually say things to the contrary about it.
I know they would.
Towing the party line.
I know they would.
I had people on Twitter say, propaganda. How dare you use that word? I knew that we had to look after certain factors of our loved ones. I was aware of that, like we do with pneumonia, like we do with all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I was aware of it, but I knew from the people I spoke to on our private WhatsApp group And I wouldn't even care if that WhatsApp group got leaked, because this was just all of us sharing information and stories and experiences that we'd gone through.
Yeah.
There was someone on there, I'm not going to mention any names, there was someone on there who was very connected to Westminster, who was telling me, that these Downing Street parties, they weren't just parties, but basically gathering in rooms and everything had gone on throughout Downing Street from the day one without a mask worn. So my point was, I didn't believe in mask wearing, because I'd heard from people that I respected that masks didn't make any difference, certainly not the cotton masks that people were trying to make a fortune off selling. And the normal masks, the blue masks, which it says on the side of the bloody box, these don't work for viruses. But anyway, never mind. I was never going to die on the mask hill. The only thing about the mask thing that got me was that that people would scowl at you if you weren't wearing a mask, but they'd be wearing theirs around their fucking chin. The chin wearing mask people that it goes on to this day. And those masks not worn properly were as much use as a chocolate fire guard as regards you not getting COVID or spreading COVID. And yet what they were done was they were forced on our children in schools, which was an appalling situation. I found wearing a mask the most close. I have asthma, and I have had breathing difficulties in the past, and I found wearing a mask the most horrendous situation, and I knew the children did. There was one of my sister's friends' kids said that he didn't know when he moved schools, he didn't know what the people in his class looked like for a year, because he never saw the smiles.
Yeah.
That's about communication. People are scarred by that. And I knew that Matt Hancock was a charlatan. I knew that he was a narcissist. I knew that he cared nothing about his own except his own career and rising up the ladder. He loved every fucking minute of it.
He should be in jail.
Yes, he should be. And therefore, yet again, when he went in the jungle and I said to people, God, you've got short memories, I was vilified and told that, how could I not move on and forget? And the main thing it was is when people started to say, well, you had an affair. You're a hypocrite. Yes, I did have an affair. I had more than an affair. I've admitted that in my autobiography. My marriage was not good, and we should have ended it, and we didn't. Thank God we've remained friends, and we're very good friends with Tim. And I don't want to go down that road, but the fact is, it wasn't about Matt Hancock having an affair. I didn't care who he had an affair with. It was so little interest to me. It was the fact that he, and now you can all see it, gloated at the fact that you weren't allowed to be with your lover, and you weren't allowed to be with your mother, and you weren't allowed to be with your dad, who was going to die very soon, and you weren't allowed to go in an ambulance with your dad, but he was with his lover. And during the times that they allowed football matches to start, could no one see that this made no sense, that you were allowed to go to the football, but I couldn't go in an ambulance with my 84-year-old terrified, vulnerable father? I wasn't allowed to see him in Durham Hospital for 3 weeks when he was so desperately on FaceTime, not understanding what was going on, because they were all so busy with different things in the hospital. Even though they told me there was no COVID in Durham Hospital at that time, they couldn't let me see my dad. And yet what was happening was his what you call them, the urinary infections that you get that make your cognitive skills go, when he started to go a little bit he couldn't. And that was because he wasn't being checked enough, because everything was just about fucking COVID and everything else was being ignored. And you knew that if you'd been in that hospital, you would have realised, sat by your dad, that your dad was dehydrated, that your dad was losing his cognitive skills and he wasn't talking properly. And you would know to say, I want to have his urine, he needs to have a urine test today.
But look at it all now. Look at the way that all of this backlog, these people with all of these illnesses and it's just with cancer and everything's everything's
But it was so
put back.
But it was so obvious, Lincoln. It was so obvious that if you make the world COVID-centric, that other people are going to die as a result. And the whole thing about the lockdown situation was that Tedros Adhanom, who was the head of the World Health Organization, we got the idea to go into lockdown from China. Right?
Yes.
Now, before China, before that province came out of lockdown for the first time, that Tedros guy from the World Health Organization was saying what a wonderful success lockdown was. And I was thinking, you don't know if it's a success or not because they're not out of lockdown yet. But my frustration was, how does nobody else see this? Why are we locking down a healthy nation? Quarantine is something quarantine is when you lock down the sick, right? You never lock down a healthy population.
Yeah.
Okay. I was a great believer. And again, people say, well, how would you have done it? I'm not saying it was easy, but people to me should have listened more to Sunetra Gupta, to Carl Hennigan. They should have listened to people who put forward the great Barrington Declaration. Yes, there were holes in that. I understand it. But COVID was only ever going to be a mild illness to the majority of people. And that became evident early on. But by this time, the power of the control had got too great. And it was easy to shepherd us all along as sheep by the terror and the fear. And if I hadn't been with my dad, with my family when he died, because the nurses broke rules to let us all be there, I would have never, ever, ever gotten over it. And you can hear that I still haven't gotten over him being poorly during COVID.
The nurses have sent you many, 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 many messages.
Well, I'm actually
your voice in that time.
I'm wearing a medallion at the moment with an engraving of my dad on it.
Yeah.
Which was sent to me just last week. An NHS nurse said, we couldn't speak out at the time, but thank you for your voice. You know, there were people that saying I was against the NHS. I couldn't have been more in support of the NHS.
I've seen all the messages.
The NHS nurses themselves were lied to. When my dad was in the Durham Hospital, and at one point Durham was not allowed any visitors at all. Then he went to the Freeman Hospital where he was allowed one visitor. Okay, and the nurses in Durham had been told that no hospitals had visiting.
Yeah. I remember.
Do you remember?
Yes.
And her saying, well, what do you mean the Freemans got visiting? We were told that nobody had visiting. And I said, you're being lied to.
Yeah.
You've got to do your own research outside of here because you're being lied to within this hospital. And, you know, and as I say, I don't have a lot of time for Boris Johnson, but I did say at the time, and it is now evident that Boris Johnson did want to listen to the other sides of the argument. You know, when he was told by Neil Ferguson's that 4,000 people a day were going to die, it's like, where were these statistics coming from? The other thing that happened was one of the doctors who you know who I'm talking about, who was a head of an IC unit in the Midlands. That's all I'm going to say. I physically spoke to him one day on the phone about something, and he said to me, I am going to tell you this. He said, I have just had to listen to the chief executive of this hospital tell the BBC News that a 29-year-old patient in this hospital has just died of COVID. And he said, that's a complete lie. That is a complete lie. And I was privy to this information and I was sharing it with you and I was getting myself in a state. You can see the state I'm getting in now. During this time as well, what was hard on us as a family, to the people listening, is that we had a stalker. The fact that we had a stalker is public knowledge now. He's in jail. He got a 7-year sentence. He committed arson at our house as well. But this caused a problem at the time with Lincoln and I, because we didn't know, and we still don't, why this guy targeted us. And Lincoln was concerned for the safety of me and our family, was that this guy was, you know, had issues, and it was because of my COVID restriction views. It could have been because of that, because it was making people mad on either side of the argument.
Yeah.
And going, you know, and then we've got Matt Hancock, who goes on fucking I'm a Celebrity and gets 400 grand, right?
400 grand.
400 grand. And then last week he's parading in a Newcastle shirt, you know, a shirt that he promised that he was going to get signed and donate to charity, which he didn't. And then the other week he turns up in the audience of fucking Dancing on Ice. What is going on?
But what's going on with these channels putting him out there, giving him the airtime? I got infuriated when I read this. It says, "We frighten the pants off everyone."
This is a WhatsApp message from Hancock. Say it again. Sorry, it's a WhatsApp message.
"We frighten the pants off everyone with the new strain." How dare he write that?
But then the other guy, who is, I believe, his PR person.
Yeah, well,
right.
Obviously, yeah.
The other person, Damien Poole, says, yes, that's what will get proper behaviour change. And Matt Hancock says, when do we deploy the new variant? When do we deploy the new variant? Like, that's his, so now we don't know what was going on there.
This is what I mean.
It's like when Omicron came out, and I know I'm talking as a layperson. I am a layperson. I don't profess to have any medical knowledge. But when Omicron came out, and suddenly the sage people were saying, oh my God, this is the worst one yet. We're all going to die again. South Africa president was sitting there going, hang on a minute. No, it's not. No, it's absolutely not. Omicron might have been a contagious variant, but it certainly wasn't the most lethal variant. And the other thing that Hancock and his like say in these WhatsApp messages is that they knew early on that the people in most danger of a severe outcome from COVID, right, were the old, average age still 82, and the obese.
Yeah.
You tell me what health drive ever happened with telling people to try and limit their calorie intake per day.
Oh, lose weight.
Yeah, there was absolutely nothing. Now, obviously, people were traumatized. We know that people need help with emotional eating. I understand that. I work for a company called Lighter Life, which is about helping people lose weight safely and changing their relationship with food. So I am the first person to have empathy and sympathy with those people who have become obese, right? In the general world, not just through COVID. But apart from one short-lived visit to hospital by Boris Johnson, who was poorly with COVID, and he came out and said, oh, my weight was obviously a problem and a contributing factor. And I'm going to get, when we saw him running outside his flat 3 or 4 times, and then that was
when he jumps out of his car and runs like 100 yards.
And then we see him, it's a bit like with the masks.
It's all theatre.
All COVID theatre.
Theatre.
Everything was COVID theatre. The mask, we've all of us, right? We've all of us, whichever side of the narrative you're on, we've all of us seen the compilation tapes of the masks, oh shit, the politicians get the masks on. Soon as the cameras are down, the masks come off, except that they're often not bright enough to see that the cameras aren't fucking down, and they're going to become a meme on Twitter. But we've seen it a million times before. Total and utter hypocrisy. And I and many, many others. And the thing is, where my standing came from was because I have been a mental health advocate for 34 years since my son Matthew was born. I've done, this, just in case nobody does, I suffered from severe postnatal depression and have continued to have periodic episodes of massive, awful, major depressive disorder. Thankfully, since September 2009, I haven't had one. Nobody knows why, but I'm just grateful. 2019. And so basically, that's when I started speaking out and trying to help those others, and certainly people who don't have a voice with mental health issues. So I could see that a mental health tsunami was going to happen. Mental health has always been the poor relation of physical health as regards how we view it, how we discuss it, how we treat it. And this was only going to make it worse. And now the amount of suicides that happened because of this fucking propaganda, okay? I was labelled an anti-vaxxer. Again, vaccines were never the hill I was going to die on. And I never, ever, ever did any anti-vax straight at all.
No.
All I've ever was against was mandates. Once we knew the transmission was just the same whether you were vaccinated or not, the whole mandate issue was over. How dare you mandate those vaccines for people who choose not to have one? How dare you not even hear the story of a friend of mine? Well, he became, an acquaintance of mine, someone that used to live near my dad, Gareth Eve, whose wife was the BBC News reporter who died at 44 years old after receiving the first AstraZeneca vaccine. Every restaurant we go in, the first thing they say before you've even even ask for a glass of water is, have you got any allergies? Have you got any allergies? Nobody asked a fucking thing about that. So the fact is, I did get vaccinated, and that was my choice. Gareth Eve did, and Lisa Eve did what they were told to do. She had the vaccine and she died from it. And all he has wanted is some recognition of that. He didn't even become an anti-vaxxer after it. That stupid word. My children had every single vaccination. I would still have them vaccinated. Well, they're grown up now, it's their choice. But if I had young children, I would still recommend they're vaccinated about things that become a life or death situation. But when something like COVID, which has a 98% survival rate, that's when I started to question things. Again, I questioned everything.
Yes, you questioned
That's all I did. I questioned everything.
That's what you did.
And I only ever asked people to ask the questions, but we were silenced and we were put into great big metaphorical pen with this horrible arrows pointing down at us as, murderers. And it was a bloody horrible time. We love hearing your comments. So if you listen to this podcast, I'd love it if you could leave a little review at the end of it, because it really does help us get it out and push it forward. I'm loving doing it. And from the responses, you're enjoying listening to it. So if you can, leave a little review. I'd be really grateful. Thank you.
I think it's how can any channel anywhere give Matt Hancock a voice on anything ever again?
Well, this is what I
ever
feel.
again,
This
ever
is what
again.
I feel, and I will.
He's
say
a criminal,
this, and I will say this because the one thing I will say about decisions at the channel I work a lot for at ITV was certainly the show that I work on, because obviously different departments have different bosses and it works very differently. On Loose Women, I have never been asked not to say anything because I was always incredibly well researched. I always came with proof. If ever I said I have spoken to a virologist or a psychologist or an epidemiologist or an ICU doctor, I would go to the producers, as I did with you, Lincoln, and say, before I say anything, because I know that I'll be slagged off on fucking Twitter, is that this is the dialogue. Here you go. Here's the dialogue I've had with this person. There's the proof of who they are, and on we go. I remember sitting on the desk at Loose Women with about half an hour to going live, and a friend of mine was working on an ambulance series in the Northeast, and he called me and he had a paramedic there, and the paramedic was in tears because they had just been yet again to attend yet another suicide in the Northeast. And this paramedic said to me, Denise, what is happening is it is not COVID that's causing the problem in this hospital right now. I'm not saying it wasn't previously. He said it's not COVID right now. It's the COVID protocol that's causing the problems. That's why we've got the lineup of ambulances here. That's why people aren't going to their GP, because the GPs are not seeing people.
No.
Mine was brilliant. That was a postcode lottery as well, as to how my friend who's a GP, she had a backdoor policy. So that she knew that if she didn't continue to do smear tests for people, that would be game over to some of those people. And she was told that she couldn't do that, and she bloody well broke the rules, and she did it, And this is the situation we're in now. And so but you have people, Lincoln, who stuck their heels in, and they were never, ever, ever going to do anything but go with that narrative. And also, living like that did please a lot of people. Some people loved the fact that there was, we were all in a lockdown situation. Nobody was going to work. Nobody was posting on Instagram. That suited their lifestyle perfectly, And of course, COVID will be here to stay now. I've had COVID twice. I've got an element of long COVID. I used to have vertigo very, very sporadically. I now have vertigo pretty much all the time. I don't luckily have it when I'm walking around.
Yeah.
But I have it every time I go to bed at night. I have it every time I wake in the night and turn. And that's been purely as a result of COVID. I have a very close relative who is still poorly after 3 years. but there has always been post-viral conditions. The fact that I'm suffering from having had the virus a bit more long-term than one would hope doesn't mean that I take anything back of what I said.
No.
So for someone who, when you said, I think you should talk about how you feel, said, I don't want to, I've never shut up for 33 minutes.
33 minutes. But that's I'm glad you have. I'm glad you have, because I've, you've always had a very, valid point on everything, and I wanted you to share it. And where should you share it? You should share it on your podcast, on your media stream. No one's going to tell you can't say it. You can say it. That's what I wanted you to do.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you did it.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be a lot of people that are glad you did it.
Yeah. I mean, I know to you listeners that it's kind of been very jumpy, but because I can only speak from my heart.
Yeah, you do.
And I never, ever, ever professed to be medically qualified, ever. And that's why I was never told that I couldn't say anything on mainstream channels, because I was always well researched and I always came with the facts. And as well as the criticism I got, and dear God, I continue to have that to this day. I had so much support as well. A lot of it's silent support.
Yeah.
But I did, I appreciate those people who did support my my voice. But the other thing, it was very confusing and upsetting for me politically, because I've always been of the left, and therefore a lot of my COVID restriction views were aligning with people from the right. And I started to be very confused as to who was I and what did I think and what were my principles and As my COVID days have become, much less, I've realized that with many of the people that I shared those views with, I share no other views with at all. So I know that my leaning is still to the left. But I think the left have a lot to learn also, with the fact that, Keir Starmer would have had us in lockdown for longer. So he never fought for our freedoms either, when he damn well knew.
No,
he damn well knew what the...
I know you'd say that.
He absolutely damn well knew the situation as well. So, he was just everything the Tories did. The usual thing of, couldn't they have just worked together more? The other thing as well was that I remember Dr. Rosanna Allen Khan, a doctor and broadcaster that I became acquainted with, and we did a sort of FaceTime live at the very beginning, and it was to do with my book, The Unwelcome Visitor, because that came out as well at the time. But she told me that at the very beginning, that she had tried for months to get an appointment with Matt Hancock to discuss the mental health impact of what they were doing.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't even pay her any heed whatsoever. So, but the fact that then it did end up with Matt Hancock in a broom closet with his lover. I know it wasn't a broom closet, but it always looked like that on the photos, wherever it was, and how he had the fucking audacity to say, I fell in love, when we were kept from those we love for a year. It's fucking disgusting. And
he's going to catch up with him. He's got to.
Anyway.
There's going to be more coming out. More.
Anyway. To those of you who've stuck with me for 37 minutes, I applaud you. Thank you very much. And thank you.
And send us any feedback.
Thank you for listening. I would absolutely love feedback, good or bad, whichever side of the coin you were on. But I would imagine that people tuning into my podcast are going to be people. But the thing is, there's a lot of people who support me and like me generally, and didn't like me through that time, as opposed to some people who had never listened to a damn word I said, and then did agree with what I said. But it did show me that I will always be prepared to put my head above the parapet. I'm never going to be somebody that just pushes other people forward to say something. And if that works to my detriment, then so be it. And if I did lose work as a result of it, then so be it. It's a bit like when I was first talking out about mental health, and people who were concerned for me have said this a million times, oh, you don't want to be talking about that. People will think you're mad and you'll lose work. Don't give a shit, because I wouldn't want to work with those people anyway. So anyway.
Good for you,
darling.
Take
me for some lunch. Thank you. I love you. So guys, if there's anything that you've ever heard me talking about that you'd like to hear more of, or indeed anything you can suggest that me, DK and Lincoln can bring to the table, contact me on denisewelchpod@gmail.com. And indeed, if you've got any questions, ask away. We'd love to hear from you.